All righty. And I'm supposed to remind everybody that they're being recorded so that nobody is documented as using any bad swears. Last week, well, first off, how was your weekend? How's everything? How's your Valentine's Day?
It's amazing. It's another good Valentine's Day. Never a letdown.
Excellent. Now, it looks like the background that you're using, is that like an AI animation or what?
I'm not sure. I thought I'd try this one out tonight. I'm not even sure what it looks like. Is it an animation?
Yeah, I
Let's
like
see.
it. It's
Let's see.
nice.
Oh, is that better?
No, the other one looked, I mean, all the flowers and everything were in. Oh, that's kind of neat. I like that. That one's animated too. Those are cool. All of these are neat. Very nice. Yep, I like that one. That's very cool. Looks like you're outside.
Yeah, I am outside. It's perfect.
Great. So how was your week and weekend?
It was great. It was good. How about yours, Andrew?
It was nice. I ran up to Utah County and I did another workshop on stained glass, and it was
Awesome.
nobody severed anything. Well, at least nothing important, and it was really nice. It's kind of exciting to me to see these grown-ups. You know, these are all professional designers, but it's the first time they get to take like a real art class, and in years, some of them, and it's mostly so that they can have the tools to communicate with their subcontractors.
Yeah.
But it's exciting to see how accomplished they feel when they finish a little window. It's just a lot of fun.
Awesome.
So that was nice. And Adam warned me on my way up that there were several storms coming along, and I used my little city by city weather map and timed everything. So I just got the slush. I got a bunch of storm warnings, but I skirted the edges of all the storm systems. So that was nice.
That's always good.
Yeah. And then coming back to St. George, realizing how silly it is that we feel miserable that we've got to wear a hat to stay warm, you know? It's just beautiful weather here. St. George is wonderful. But last week we were talking about, I think futurism, I've always kind of liked it until I read the manifesto. And then it just became super, super sad. You know, and there's always this element when there are really dramatic art movements, there's always this idea of inflammatory language being used to describe how they kill the old. But it always has the feel of when talks about getting baptized and um, burying the old man, you know, the old person that you used to be, or when when Buddha talks about destroying the old person, you know, the past life, and it's so you always know that it's metaphor, and then with the futurists, they're really serious about it not being a metaphor. And I always wondered why the movement just completely died out, and it was because everybody went to war to kill other people, and they all died. That's one way to end a movement. And I really like the very strong counterpoint to that with the different architectural movements we looked at. Same time period, same world they were living in, but they wanted to work with the old and learn from it rather than kill it. Practically, and I really like that. And today it's kind of the same kind of thing a little bit. We're dealing with a very similar set of circumstances. This runs concurrent for a lot of its history with futurism and the prairie style and all those kinds of things. They overlap quite a bit, and the viewpoint is still dealing with getting rid of the old and coming up with something new. But the difference is, like the Russian constructivists, the name comes from the fact that they wanted to build a new future without the czars. This is right after the czar's family was all slaughtered. Really horrible. They thought they were being protected by friends of theirs. They were escorted to the basement, and then even the pets were killed. You know, just really horrible. And then constructivism rose out of the desire to build a new world where everybody was equal and you didn't have the awful dispersion of wealth and freedom between the czar and the peasant, you know. But then with Dada, the enemy there that they're fighting is the disconnected wealthy and the gallery system with who gets to actually live the life that the wealthy are directing. You know, one of the things that one of the Dada artists was really angry about was this fact that when there's a war and all the young men are conscripted, the bourgeois or the rich have the money to pay for somebody else to fight in the stead of their son. And when everybody's conscripted, it gives a level playing field. But when you have the money to save the life of your son at the expense of somebody else's son, it becomes a really horrible commentary on what the abuse of wealth can do in a society, I think. And so both of these movements, I think, are really parallel. They're talking about, they're dealing with the idea of confronting the oppressively rich and trying to build a new social order. But constructivism, I think, smacks a bit of futurism in that violence is a perfectly appropriate way to, or they feel that violence is a perfectly appropriate way to deal with the issue. And the difference is, in futurism, it was calling people to arms and calling people to kill the unnecessary. And in constructivism, for a large part, they felt they'd already done that, and they were building a new world to show that the rest of the world what it would look like, the utopia you would build by getting rid of the super wealthy. And then the Dadaists, they wanted to show their disdain for the absurdly wealthy by countermanding all of their expectations and going directly against them. And so we have a similar situation in both cases. Both groups of artists felt that they were betrayed and abused by the ones with an extreme amount of wealth, but they both deal with it in a very, very different ways. I think, you know, the Dadaists felt something of a kinship with these other groups, but as far as I know, none of the Dadaists actively sought, outside of metaphor, for the killing of the wealthy. You know, they wanted people to learn to think for themselves. And anytime a culture or a group of people want to direct a culture, and they feel on some level that it might be against their best interest, they really don't want the culture to think for themselves. And the Dadaists, that was one of the ways they struck at the bourgeoisie by begging people to think for themselves. And so there's a lot of artists. We're not going to get through them all tonight at all, but I will put up short videos for all of them so you guys can, you know, have the time to look at them. And I try really hard to keep these videos to between 2 and 5 minutes, because it is a lot of stuff to get through. But this is also one of those things where if you just look at, you know, for 30 seconds at each of the videos, you can really see how these guys tie together. And I think some of the things that they said make a lot of sense within the context that they're working. But I think we also got to take into account that those portions of what they say we want to connect with, we want to make sure that it doesn't lead us to armed uprising, like it did for the you know, the constructivists were just coming off of that. But the other thing is we need to remember to look at these movements within the realm that they lived. This is 1920s, early teens. So, right around as the world is shifting into World War I and then coming out of it and moving to, towards World War II. And so in Europe and Russia at this time, there were such things as telephones and flush toilets, but a lot of the time you still had this huge disparity where the wealthy had all the machines and everything, and the people at the bottom of the totem pole, which, that's not even fair. It's like, it's the people that at the other end of the water line, at the sewage end of the water line, they're the ones that still had the outhouses that you had to sprinkle chalk on to keep the smell down. They're the ones where people would die from an infected hangnail because they didn't have access. They didn't trust the doctors whose educations were paid for by the bourgeoisie. You have this huge economic disparity, a huge disparity of education. And I think this is one of the reasons why I really, really like the Dadaists, because in order to understand what they're doing or appreciate what they're doing or respect what they're doing, they require you to think for yourselves. And they're one of those groups of artists like the Cubists that believed that their audience was honestly intelligent, and that you would get it if you took the time to think about it. That's the reason why I love Cubism so much, because all those guys respected the human beings looking at their artwork because they knew if you were smart, you would get it, and they assumed that you were smart. And I love that. And in about 1915, there were a couple of artists in the it was becoming the Soviet Union. I don't remember the year that the Tsar had been killed, but the Soviets, and this is also about the time of the Chinese, the Cultural Revolution. But we're talking about a time period where whole villages would freeze to death or starve to death on the whim of the Tsar. And at this time as well, the leadership of what became the Soviet Union needed to have something that led people together in a cohesive way, to really help people unite. And they were, in their minds, building a utopia. That's why it's called Constructivism. They're building a new utopia. One of the early leaders of Constructivism said, we declared uncompromising war on art. His name was Alexei Gan. And because it was felt that for too long, art had been used as a tool of oppression, because it had become a symbol, or it was a symbol of the wealthy who could afford it, who could pay for the people to make the art. And so constructivist artists were directed to reclaim the creative processes and direct their use towards the building of a utopia. So this is, institutionalized propaganda on a nationwide scale, not even an empire-wide scale. The Soviets did not think of or refer to themselves necessarily as an empire, because they felt that they were building a utopia, but they controlled several countries, and rivaling to many extents the British Empire around the world, and with their fingers in so many pies. So I think we can safely call them an empire. I don't think that would be bad at all. And I have several videos that kind of give a background to constructivism, and I thought I would just show a couple of them again, because I'm sorry about that. The reason I wanted to show just a couple of them in this was because you can watch other stuff on your own as well. I'm sorry, for whatever reason, as I am trying to share these videos with you, the sound is really screwed up. So let me see if I can fix that. So while we're together, what I wanted to do is show a brief introduction to constructivism. It doesn't talk a lot. This one doesn't talk an awful lot about the history. It's the Art History 101 videos that I really like. And then I wanted to just show several of the artists and just have us talk about the kinds of things that seem to unite these artists. So let me do the little share feature here. So what's been your experience with constructivism and Dada?
This is really interesting, Andrew. The Soviet constructivism is really interesting to me. Um, I I like the idea of their thought that they could utilize art as a form of propaganda to create their own utopia. I think that's a really interesting pathway to actually I could see how this could work really well for that specific population in that time period because art was potentially, in my opinion, and what we've been learning in this class as well, it was almost only utilized for significantly wealthy populations. And I think it's a really interesting instrument or tool that they were able to use to start this push towards a socialist realist perspective.
Well, and it's the 19th century, towards the end of the Industrial Revolution, that's when you get this huge growth in Europe of a middle income population. And that 19th century, with the birth of realism and romanticism, that was the first time that relatively ordinary people could lay claim to art. Everybody else had cheap prints or cheap drawings. And still in Russia, the czars and the leaders, they're the ones that held the stranglehold on quote unquote culture. The stuff that ordinary folks had access to, they couldn't afford the costly red pigment or the blue pigment. They couldn't. It is really interesting to me that the people at the start of the Soviet world building were taking something that was such a symbol of oppression and directing it towards building what they viewed was heaven on earth. And I think that is really amazing. Now, Mao Zedong, he said that art only had validity as it pushed forward the intents of the state, but it seemed like the Soviets were saying, this is for the betterment of everybody. We're not just forcing people how to think the way that we want them to think. This is going to help us build a better world. And I look at their perspective is more akin to Confucian painting than Chinese propaganda art, I think, because in Confucian painting, that's a 2,000-year-old tradition where it was vitally important to share the ideal world so that everybody knew that you could create heaven on earth. And you create heaven on earth by showing proper respect to those around you. And that's an ancient tradition that I think is beautiful. It's not, in that case, it wasn't viewed as propaganda by the people that used it. It was viewed as sharing the idealized an idealized reality to incentivize people to create utopia as well. So I think it's astounding, and so the Soviet constructionism or the Russian constructivism, in my mind, by the people that actually did it, Of course, it was used as a tool by government, of course, just like a lot of this kind of stuff was. But by the artists that actually participated, it feels to me that they were more akin to those Confucian artists than they were to, the propaganda masters of World War II. You know what I mean? It very much a perspective change, and I think it's really interesting. But I wanted to share this. It's about 6 minutes long, and again, if you're most of these, I think, have showed up in the videos. Occasionally, when I show one of these, YouTube will block it and force me to edit it out of the finished class video. So this is called Soviet Constructivism Introduction by Art History 101. This will be, this is in the module. So if YouTube does cut it out, you'll know what you're missing. So let's go ahead and listen.
Moving on to Soviet Constructivism. Now, Soviet Constructivism really is tied to the advent and early development of the Soviet Union. It is half politics, half aesthetics. The style that we now call Soviet Constructivism was an artistic design and architectural movement that began in Russia from around 1914 or 1917 on.
As we go through this too, cast your mind back to what we talked about the Bauhaus last week, because they were very active in creating a similar environment as well from the modernist perspective in other parts of Europe.
Word, favoring applied art with a social purpose rather than art for art's sake. So the art has to exist to beautify something that's going to be utilitarian in some way. You can imagine this being used as political propaganda or in structures that will push political ideas or be practical. You get the idea. And it borrows ideas from Cubism as well as Futurism, but was entirely new in its approach to making objects. One which sought to abolish the traditional artistic concern with composition and replace it with construction. Building things as opposed to composing things. Constructivism called for a careful technical analysis of modern materials, and it was hoped that this investigation would eventually yield ideas that could be used in mass-produced products.
Well, and I'm pausing this again because that's an important thing. In constructivism, the artists involved, all the artists involved are very aware of the materials that they're using. Just like we looked at Prairie Style and Art Nouveau, the artists there are building homes that make use of contemporary materials and allow the contemporary materials to perform the way that they're meant to. And in constructivism, that was vital as well. So the awareness of what they're doing ties into Confucianism or Confucianist art, but the way that the reason they're designing ties in with the Bauhaus, and their awareness of giving material its own voice as you construct with it ties in with the Art Nouveau and Prairie Style as well. So I think that those are really interesting things to consider.
Serving the ends of a modern communist society. They want a practical end to whatever they create. Ultimately, however, the movement flounders in trying to make the transition from the artist studio to the factory. Now, Russian constructivism was in decline by the mid-1920s, partially a victim of the Bolshevik regime's increasing hostility to avant-garde art. Not unlike Futurism, they exalted the machine as a source of universal progress in both its content and aims. Constructivism was hugely influential amongst progressive artists and designers across Europe. So let's talk about some of their ideals. Constructivists proposed to replace art's traditional concern with composition with a focus on construction. Objects were to be created not in order to express beauty.
I think you can really see that. This gives rise to very quickly to Soviet brutalism, which was a style of architecture that I just think is completely without any soul whatsoever. But in this early stage, and while it's still constructivist rather than brutalist, there is, I think, I don't know if you see what I see, Van, where it feels to me like there's this awareness of the inherent beauty of geometry akin to what the Bauhaus was doing. So that even though they're claiming that they want practicality and pragmatism over aesthetics, there is still this element of beauty and balance to it that I think is really intriguing.
Mhm.
But to carry out a fundamental analysis of the materials and forms of art, one which might lead to the design of a functional object, hopefully, a design of a functional object. For many of these constructivists, this meant an ethic of being true to their materials. So they're not going to try and create illusion like you would see from the Cubists. They want to maintain a purity of material so that they truly understand that material and maybe come up with something revolutionary that would increase the living standard for everyone in the Soviet Union or wherever else. So constructivist art often aims to demonstrate how materials behave, to ask, for instance, what different properties had materials such as wood, glass, and metal. The form an artwork would take would be dictated by its materials rather than the materials dictating the form. So the artist will not transform the materials so much as construct and make use of the materials. For some, these inquiries were a means to an end, the goal being the translation of ideas and designs into mass production. For others, it was an end itself, a new modern style expressing the dynamicism of modern life. Really, the seed of constructivism was a desire to express the experience of modern life, its dynamicism, its new and disorienting quality.
Now, I'm pausing this again here because this particular style is, I find it kind of, well, I find it very beautiful. There are these gorgeous shapes, I think, and very simplified color palette. I say gorgeous because they're claiming that their only intention is to use the material for what it is, but they still have this inherent aesthetic balance and awareness of geometry that blends together really beautifully. I mean, looking at this, this appears to be something of a silk screen, perhaps a print like that. But what's very nice about it is it's rendered in a perspective with these flowing forms and balancing solid with this kind of cagey grid to give it a visual informal balance. Sheets of glass with the windows are balanced with solid walls and forms. And then you get this arc right here. And this is a building. I don't know if this is an apartment complex or something like this, or if it was just intended to be a graphic design exercise for architecture. But what I'm seeing is artists working with the constraints of the materials, not to force, not to limit them, but to kind of demonstrate what the materials can do and still help this structure that feels like it's solidly placed in a machine environment, still help it to feel like there's an aesthetic flow to it. And it's a particular aesthetic that I think it's difficult for us to approach, but it feels to me like it's doing some of the same things that Art Nouveau did in a machine landscape rather than inviting in a natural landscape.
Andrew,
Yeah.
it looks a lot like almost like a modern industrial feel. And I'm looking at the screen, your backdrop. It looks almost sci-fi.
Yeah, very much so.
And
You know,
I really like the direction they're going with it. Until they moved into more to the brutalist approach, which I love as well. But this is really futuristic, it looks like, and it looks hopeful
yeah,
towards
yeah, yeah.
towards something new.
And I think that's what brutalism kind of, and you know, I know that I'm being prejudiced, but this is one of the things as a constructivist or first starting, they know in their hearts they are building a utopia that the world has never seen before.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of this hope and energy in it. And one thing that they work really hard to do is they the Soviets felt that church and faith was used by the ultra rich ruling people to keep everybody else down. And you know, it's so faith and God become symbols of the abuse of power. So that they're trying to build a society, an environment without reference to God. So they are exploring aesthetics and balance and hopefulness without the typical ratios and symbols that we unconsciously use that come from this kind of religious environment. And that, which is something else that I find really, really intriguing, because it does feel hopeful. It does feel like it's looking towards a bright future, but it isn't doing that with reference to Christianity or any other faith. And I think that's really interesting to me. I find it very exciting.
Qualities of space and time. But also crucial was the desire to develop a new form of art more appropriate to the democratic and modernizing goals of the Russian Revolution. And democratic not meaning in terms of politics, but giving power to the people. Whole another ball game there. Constructivists were to be constructors of a new society, cultural workers on par with scientists in their search for solutions to modern problems. So let's look at their political propaganda. Artists saw art in the service of.
I want to point out that this is not historical, just you know, for anybody who's wondering. But what is interesting to me is uh, the designers of the different Star Wars sets, the different environments, are very aware of constructivist architecture, fascist architecture, you know, Italian futurism. They're very aware of Nazi military design, and they use a lot of that in not as much as Zack Snyder did in Rebel Moon. You know, that is pretty much the SS game plan and design straight out. But George Lucas and his team for the Dark Empire were trying to bring a lot of those elements together, and you can see them in the design of the interior of the Star Destroyer, you know, and the different spaceships that they have, how the clean and brutal lines of the spaceships that they have, and even the designs and the mechanical tanks that they use, you know, the walkers and all those kinds of things make a lot of reference to constructivism and later Nazi design, which is really interesting.
Of the Soviet system. They were in favor of this socialist or communist system. They integrated art and life, hoping that the art would foster the ideological aims of the new society as well as its citizens. However, only in Russia is the revolution in art and politics so closely linked. Elsewhere, we don't see quite the close link. And it's the artists trying to get close to the politicians occasionally taking advantage, but never really understanding the power of art and backing off from time to time, sometimes pushing them away and trying to get away from the avant-garde ideas that they saw at the base of many of these forms in Soviet constructivism.
So you think you...
I think that's an important point that is made. This is not, Soviet constructivism is not necessarily propaganda like we think of it today. It was not directed by the government. It was directed by artists united in this idea that they were building a utopia. And it wasn't until the World Wars when the government started directing the artists towards intentional propaganda the way that we think of it. Because up until that point, the propaganda aspect came in that these were art pieces intentionally directed to help people think a certain way, but it wasn't, up until even the late 30s, and even during the 40s, a lot of the Soviet leaders did not understand anywhere near the way that the Nazis did how art could be used to direct public opinion, which I think is really fascinating. This guy, Vladimir Tatlin, is an artist that is really important to this whole idea. He played with he was making architectural models that were actually sculptures, but they were things that he felt could actually be made with construction materials available at the time. Oh, Brittany's here. Let's let her in. Hey, Brittany.
Hey.
We are talking about Soviet constructivism, and we're talking about Vladimir Tatlin. And I'm just going to show this really quick 3-minute thing, and then we'll kind of circle around and talk about a little bit more about the art movement and everything. So we're talking about a period of time that overlaps the Italian futurists quite a bit, moving forward, where the new Soviet artists are using art as a tool to help build utopia. And Vladimir Tatlin is one of these principal artists. So I want to play this, and then we'll circle around back and talk about him more.
We're looking at is Vladimir Tatlin, who's a founder of Russian constructivism. And he visits Picasso's studio in 1914. So he's aware of the more recent avant-garde developments in Europe. And he develops a specific form called a counter-relief as a result of his visit to Picasso's studio, probably looking at the maquette for guitar from 1912. So he probably saw designs like that, and he creates these pieces. They're as far removed from the earthbound traditions of sculpture as the technical resources of the artist permitted. What he's doing is he's studying the materials when creating these sculptures. There's actually almost a scientific study going on in the background. It's almost impressionism mixed, and their study of light and color mixed with abstraction in terms of construction. And we start with this counter-relief, and this is sometimes called counter-relief corner. The sculpture here is put together from parts found in the St. Petersburg Museum at the time. And he's piecing these together in a corner. You can see the corner in the background. If it's not real clear, here's the corner running up the back of the piece. So it's actually crossing between two separate walls. And that's necessary to get across that idea of three-dimensionality. Because the materials are not bound as regular sculpture, this item tends to invade the viewer's space. It's, of course, coming forward, separate from the wall. Now, he's always worked with an eye towards accentuating the properties of the material. So he wants to focus on how these materials work. For example, metals. Metals are really good at being curved or bent. So every time we see a metal in this object, we see it curved. String is great at tension, string or rope. So we see it pulled across the surface. Wood is good at holding sort of a straight line. So that's what we're seeing here. He considers the truth to the material. What does the material really want to be? And again, you can see this kind of almost scientific study of what you can do with these materials. For example, drilling holes through the metal so that the string or rope can hold it all together. And as we look at, it's really embracing the Russian Revolution or ideas about it. This piece and his ideas will lead to an interest in architecture and in engineering. So this is where he starts. Let's look at where he goes in a couple of years.
So I really like this. I think it's a beautiful example of that kind of thing that we were talking about. Constructivism, it refers to constructing a new utopia, but it also refers to the materials being used as being honest and true to the material itself. And I think that that is really a very cool point because we have a tendency to believe that artists just use the material to do what they want. And a lot of the times that's how artists will talk about what they're doing too. But I don't know, if you sit behind Dale and watch him paint, for example, or McGarren or anybody like that, yes, they're applying color in specific areas, but they're also paying attention to what their brush can do and what their brush wants to do. And they're paying attention to the translucency of the paint and what the paint wants to do. They're not trying to give voice to the paint. They're allowing the paint to speak for itself in the areas that they think are important. And I think that that's a really fascinating way. You talk to them and they're probably not going to talk about their own work in that way, but you have a conversation with somebody who paints with oil paint for the very first time, and it's amazing how frustrated they get because the paint doesn't do what they want it to. Do you know what I mean? Have you gone to a painting one class and seen that? People getting angry because the paint isn't paying attention. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
I've experienced that. Last semester I took the beginning oil painting class. It is freaking like irritating when it won't do what you want it to do.
Well, I think that's thank you. That's really excellent because, and then you look at this piece by Catlin, this counter relief. Let's see if I can share that screen again. You look at this piece by him, and I really love what the narrator pointed out, that he's using scientific methodology as in essence to put this together. There's still a sense of beautiful aesthetic balance to this. He's very aware of geometry. He's very aware of what the eye wants to do and how light and dark relate to each other. But he is purposely emphasizing and showing off the voice of the material itself without forcing it into any sort of other narrative or environment. I mean, the rope is being rope. The metal is performing as metal, and the wood is very much wood. And I think you could take that and move it in a lot of different ways, but I really enjoy seeing that piece as a model for how the constructivists thought. I think it's an excellent example. And the next one we're going to look at is an artist that looks very much like McGarren. I have one of the videos I have is at the Tate Modern. It was a show with Rodchenko and Popova, but and that's in the module. But I want to share with you instead a video introducing you to one of these guys he was a participant in the surrealist painting movement in Europe, and his excitement at constructivism led him to adapt photography and do all sorts of really incredible stuff. And in real life, he looks quite a bit like an angry McGarren.
Alexander Rodchenko.
I'm sorry. So I hit the wrong button there, so you heard the voice instead.
Alexander Rodchenko is perhaps the most important avant-garde artist to have put his art in the service of a political revolution. In this regard, his career is really a model of the clash between modern art and radical politics. He will emerge as a fairly conventional painter, but his encounters with Russian futurists propel him to become an influential founder of the Constructivist movement. And his commitment to the Russian Revolution will encourage him to abandon first painting and then fine art in its entirety, and instead put his skills in the service of industry, as well as the service of the state, designing everything from advertisements to book covers. His life's work was a ceaseless experiment with an extraordinary array of media, from painting and sculpture to graphic design and photography. Later in his career, however, the increasingly repressive policies targeted against the avant-garde artists in Russia will lead him to return to painting. Basically, he becomes disenfranchised with all of these ideas and returns to his roots, to the painting that he started with. But before he gets there, he does a couple of key pieces. First, there is hanging construction. Now, this is actually a nest of concentric circles which move freely in the air. And interestingly, they all fold down into a single flat panel. So they're cut from a single collapsible piece of plywood so that they can be stored between exhibitions. They're basically held together with wires or strings, which allow them to fold back into that single piece. He also makes further pieces, not just with circles, but with squares, triangles, and hexagons. Here we see one with squares, same basic concept. And these reveal an interest in math and geometry through the use of geometric planar forms, suggesting a fascination.
I really find that these are amazing, these hanging constructions, because they are made out of a material where the material is being used to its strengths, but it's almost scientific in the way that it uses geometry and the potentials of geometry to create these forms. But then there's also this informal balance that I think it just aesthetically is very satisfying. What do you guys think?
They remind me of mobiles almost.
Yeah, they look very much like mobiles, and it looks to me like they're designed to hang and be enjoyed. You know, this strikes me, even the square one. I really love the circle one, but even the square one is pleasant. This still has that kind of, like Van, what you pointed out earlier, this still has this kind of hopeful vision of that desired utopia still in there. And it's not making reference to religious symbolism at all. It's making reference to the idea of truth as symbolized by science, kind of thing. And that hope comes through proactive construction. And I find that these pieces still feel very satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Alexander Rodchenko is another constructivist. He does a lot of photography where his imagery is used throughout later Soviet propaganda poster as well. But he is very interested in just the graphic elements that can go into making a photograph. So in this, you know, it's essentially a photo of a mother and child walking on stairs. But the camera placement adds a dynamism to it. The very strong sense of shadow, cast by the lips of each of these stair steps, and then the particular clothing, the dark coat carried by the mother. So the only way that you can really see the form is by their silhouette and their placement of the silhouette against the brightness of the stairs. I think all that coming together makes this a photograph that feels more like a dramatic painting almost. I think it's not quite cubist, but it has that same kind of sense of geometry to it. And Alexander Rodchenko keeps doing this. He finds many different opportunities to apply this awareness of geometry in his photographs so that they end up feeling more almost like paintings that are informed by cubism than snapshots. They are not in any way, shape, or form mere snapshots. But I love the dramatic angles that he consistently uses. This is him and his partner, who is also a professional photographer and painter. She did an awful lot of propaganda posters and things like that as well. Even an image as simple as a family playing in a park still has very powerful graphic strength to it, I think. And his photographs are just amazing. And again, it's this exploration of geometry and informal balance that has kind of a hopeful feel to the whole thing. And this is one of his self-portraits that I particularly like, that self-portrait. Taking a picture of yourself, making a selfie with a distorting mirror is a lot of fun. Lyubov Popova was a painter, and I think in this you can really see the powerful impact that Cubism had on her. And I'm going to go through some of these rather quickly. This, it feels to me that there's something, that armored train with the futurists that we saw last week. This feels like that has a reference to some of the way that color was used in there. But I also, some of those, like the still life with grapes that we saw with the Cubists, it makes me think of that too. The kind of awareness of perhaps sharing the passage of time, but also tempering that with a very powerful sense of it's almost a scientific awareness of the nature of shape. And this feels more like a mathematical composition than a still life. And I feel that her paintings have this kind of delicacy to them that comes with the sensitive aspects of Cubism, but they're also very informed by scientific use of shape, as well as a very strong narrative presence of the constructed landscape. Like here, I feel that these almost look like girders, like in Rodchenko's imagery of those glass towers. This feels like it's a similar awareness. And this is very much the constructed landscape, but this reminds me of those urban cityscapes that we saw with the Cubism too. Now this one, Moshe Ginsburg was an architect, and what I found is somebody who this person is an animator, and what they do is reconstruct Moshe's buildings with animation. And so this is really interesting because it shows cross sections of what he did and presents them in a way that they're almost like graphic paintings of Moshe's architecture. And I think it really helps us to see, like, this bears a lot of resemblance to that initial constructivist building that we saw in the one video. And I think it's really interesting to watch. So I would take the time to watch this as well, because it shows how he thought, or it kind of demonstrates how he may have thought about when he built his buildings. And it's more of a graphic depiction that I think makes the buildings a lot more interesting than to just see them as subjects of photography. But these buildings, it's obvious that they are designed to perform a specific function, but I think it's also apparent that they are designed to make use of the strengths of the materials. And this is, Moshe Ginsburg is one of the first architects to use the idea of supporting an entire cement building on what appears to be just a series of thin columns. You know, that's what's important. The building is also supported on other stuff underneath, but he's taking advantage of the strength of reinforced concrete to form that the floor of that second layer. He's depending on that strength to support all of the building. And so I think it's really an interesting way to kind of play with material expectations, but also being very aware of the strength of the material that he's using. So I think his designs are really interesting in that perspective. And Gustav Klutzes is another artist who, he's the guy who designed these historical posters that, and still, this is at a time when the government is not really aware of how to make use of propaganda, but he is, Gustav is very aware of graphic imagery and how to direct the eye and how to make use of photographic collage, for example, and as well as text in an image, making the text a graphic element of the image itself as well. And this guy's yakking about it quite a bit, so we're not going to watch it. But you know, he's making these photo collages of, if I can find the right thing, of several hands all coming together to kind of demonstrate kind of a wave or pointing to the future, as well as a sense of unification. Let's see if I can get, yeah, here's a better image. And I think I don't understand, so I can't read Cyrillic, but it's fascinating to me how Gustav Klutzes is very aware of the dynamic and dramatic nature that print can have as a graphic element of some of the artwork. Now, Lisitsky is another artist who, this ties us back to that early introduction that we watched of Constructivism, where in this particular image, we have a collage of different forms coming together, but there's also this very strong sense, I think, of hopeful, futuristic, scientific manufacture. I don't know how else to say that. It feels very balanced. It feels very dramatic, but it also feels very aesthetically pleasing too. It's not just a harsh expression of the manufactured landscape. It feels, to me, this kind of communicates this hopeful nature of scientific progress and purposeful progress. With, you have an individual here, that the measuring compass is there and, as a symbol of what their eyes are doing. And it's a combination of engineering instruments with ancient surveying instruments, referencing to both scientific design and the constructed landscape. You have this kind of, it feels to me like these are almost symbols. Well, they are math and geometry symbols, but they seem to be used in such a way that kind of ties it in with that sense of the Bauhaus personalized design. And then we have kind of a human being, a human face collaged into this area as well to kind of give a ceiling to it. We have the dramatic lighting that we saw with Jenko's photographs, but it's all tied together in this painting that seems to communicate a hopefulness that comes through scientific rationale and materials use, as opposed to philosophy or religion, which I think is really interesting. And then going back, do you guys remember the Faubus at all from a couple of weeks ago? And that kind of experimentation with raw color and form. This next artist, this is Alexandra Exter, and she did painting. This kind of feels to me like a bridge between the Faubus and the very hopeful. He was not Wassily Kandinsky. I'm sorry, the name, as soon as I opened my mouth to start talking about him, the name left me.
Is it Marc Chagall?
Yes, Marc Chagall. Yes, thank you. So the fact that you can see that without me saying who it was leads me to believe that it's not entirely a figment of my imagination. Do you kind of feel, because Marc Chagall delights me because he lived in a time that was particularly harsh for Jews, for especially creative Jews, but all of his paintings shout out this hopefulness and benevolent look at the world at large, and that's what I see in Alexandra's work as well. She is using the shapes and color that many people associate with Faubism, but it's with this delighted hopefulness that I think is really beautiful. I mean, she did a lot of stuff like that, where you see these touches of cubism and touches of Art Deco design and Faubism, but in all of them, there's this kind of exuberant positivity that I think is really beautiful. And she was Soviet, which I'm sure irritates an awful lot of people. And then you get things like this. This feels very Faubist to me, and it feels very dramatic. This doesn't reek of the hopefulness that is in so many of her other things. But then, a lot of her stuff returns to it. This reminds me very much of what we just saw with Lissitzky. Just kind of a dramatic use of those kind of out of context architectural references. But it also reminds me of the Rodchenko surrealist flavor to his photography. And so I really like the exuberance and color that she uses in most of her stuff. And I am going through these rather quickly. Namgabo is somebody else whose work I really love. He's very aware of what cardboard and steel will do, as rolled sheets, and he makes these forms that are specifically designed to use the strengths of the material to create new forms with that material. And for me, this feels like this. I believe this is a librarian. I think I can't remember the name, but it makes it. It's very cubist in that you feel like you're seeing different perspectives at the same time, or different views at the same time, and it's constructivist in that he's very aware of what the material can do and what the material should be asked to do, and I think it's really beautiful. And some of them, it's titled Construction in Space Soaring. This feels to me like it's that retro sci-fi art kind of thing going on. It feels like this would be a design for the ideal space station almost. I think it's pretty amazing. So what are some of the things that you see? And we're only going to spend like a couple minutes because I've got to go on and introduce you to Dadaism. I get carried away with some of the stuff that I really like. What kind of one of the underlying threads that you see through the Soviet constructivism that we saw?
I see, Andrew, a lot like what we talked about before is this. It's a totally new perspective on life and how to create certain structures. It seems like it's different from futurism that we discussed last week in that it's much more oriented towards constructing a more positive viewpoint of what direction society potentially can go towards a utopia and towards something that is beneficial for more than just a certain amount of people.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that because I really feel this is not wanting to kill the old. Rather, this is a focus on building the new. And I think that's a really valuable distinction. It feels very hopeful. Now, as the world was getting ready for World War I, so I'm switching gears, I'm moving over to Europe. At the time period that the Soviets are growing from Russia, throwing off the czars and working towards building their utopia in Europe, particularly in Germany and a lot of the country, in France and areas like that, there is this growing awareness of the power that the people with money have, and people are very upset. I mean, this is one of the driving forces for the futurists. They hate the fact that there are people with money that seem to be the reason for everybody's despair. And you see the same thing happening everywhere where there are communities of people that feel that they can't get a job, they can't provide for their family, and it's got to be somebody else's fault. It can't be their fault. And it can't be a worldwide economic downturn that's nobody's fault. It has to be somebody's fault. A lot of the reaction of the Dadaists come from this awareness of the inequity that comes from people of wealth and power misusing or abusing their wealth and power. The way that some cultures dealt with this was by openly having the wealthy pay taxes so that someone else could fight on their behalf. And in this case, if somebody has to go to war, unless you can get your son a really super cushy job, so that he can go out and flash his sword and then work in a safe office for the rest of the war, then a lot of these families, and it was even happening throughout World War I, would pay for somebody who didn't even show up, who was so poor they couldn't even show up on a census, and they would pay to step in their behalf of their son to fight in their name. And this was viewed as particularly despicable. But then you also have artists who feel, they're coming off the wave of Impressionism that was incredibly liberating, and Fauvism that was almost oppressively liberating because they made so many people get sick. But artists were very aware that the galleries that sold their art also demanded specific things from the artists, like because they felt they were in control of the colors that were in, the subject matters that were in. This year, it's really important that everybody paint landscapes with these particular colors. And a group of artists used new, less expensive communication technologies to kind of coordinate their efforts and start a movement that was one, it was both to counteract or to demonstrate against the just the assumed power that the wealthy had, as well as force viewers to think for themselves and to proactively ask themselves questions. What do I like in art that isn't being told to me by the gallery system, by other people who are wealthy, they're the ones commissioning works to be shown in museums to kind of pat themselves on the back because they're so civic minded. You know what? So these artists were both expressing in nonviolent ways a very what is the word? Revolutionary kind of thinking about art. You know, they're revolting against societal norms, but they're also demanding and requiring that people think for themselves, which I think is really interesting because it really, if you are in any sort of economic situation where it's to your financial benefit to have people react the way that you need them to react, you don't want them to think for themselves. Thinking for yourself is an enemy to the Facebook algorithm, for example. It depends on you thinking the way that you're supposed to be thinking in relation to what you're being told. And so I wanted to share a couple demonstrations about what Dada is. The word Dada was applied by the founders of Dadaism because at its core, it doesn't mean anything. And the reason it's associated with Dada is because the art movement needed a label, but they wanted something that didn't have any meaning that could symbolize a label. And so they made up the word Dada. And I wanted to share an image of the banner girl for Dadaism. Hannah Hoek was an expert in making collages, and her collages are incredibly intellectual. And I wanted to share the guy that went out of his way to offend as many people as possible with forcing them to confront these ideas about, you know, what makes art, what validates art as art. And I also wanted to demonstrate by following, you know, the quote unquote rules of Dada literature, how a poem that you're familiar with can be transformed and expressed in the Dada way. So let's start with Hannah Hoek. Absolutely brilliant woman. She does not get any credit. I don't know if we met her, if we would be offended or really enjoy her company. My thought is we'd probably really enjoy her company, but she is, just so abrasively intelligent. She really knows her stuff. But this is Cut with a Kitchen Knife, the short title. The full title is Cut with a Kitchen Knife, Dada Through the Last Weimar Beer Belly Cultural Epic of Germany. Very simple, easy to roll off the tongue title. And this is an example of what she did. She would make collages, which flew in the face. You know, art is supposed to be painting or sculpture. So she made collage out of things that were already published. So, you know, Dada is cut from a magazine article, Anti is cut from the newspaper, and all these things come from different elements of that. And I wanted to, in just a minute, we'll watch a short video where it really dissects and parses down what Hannah Hoek achieved. And there's a guy named, this irritates me, Magritte. He is the godfather of surrealism, and he also becomes something of a symbolic champion for what the Dadaists were doing. And he did one of Magritte's paintings that I think is absolutely wonderful is this one. simply called This Is Not a Pipe. The reason why I wanted to, this is a surrealist image, but it fits perfectly with the Dadas. On one hand, it's obviously a pipe. Why do you think he's labeled it, This Is Not a Pipe? What do you think he's inviting us to do as the viewer? And what is he depending on us to do as a viewer? This is also one of the earliest examples of an intentionally conceptual art piece.
Is he having the viewer starting to think for themselves?
Yeah, he's forcing you to confront that idea. You're presented with a photorealistic painting of a pipe and being told that it's not a pipe, but it is obviously a pipe. So what is the aspect of it that's not a pipe? It's because it's an image. And it's like, I don't know, this isn't BYU, so I can say that I'm a real fan of Deadpool. I love the Deadpool movies. But one of the things that Deadpool does is break the narrative fourth wall. He's interacts with the audience directly, and he's the first comic book character of the modern age of comic books that is very aware that he lives in an environment where there's an audience, and he's interacting with an audience, and he's a fictional character. So that's how the writers play with Deadpool. And Magritte is doing the same thing from a breaking expectations about painting and relational painting or realistic portrayal in painting. And I think it's really kind of a fun idea, because when you start thinking about what he's doing and you engage with it as an intelligent viewer, it transforms into something completely different than just remaining a painting. And I really enjoy that. So we're going to watch a really short 2-minute video in just a second. But before we get to that, I wanted to read a poem that I wrote in the Dada tradition. And I call this poem Jabberwockish. All into arms as a while back, Bandersnatch, beamish beware. Birdbite blade, Borogro's boy, brillig burbled by Calais. Calloo cane catch, chorled claws, come day, dead, did eyes flame. Foe, frabjous, frumious, galumphing, gimbal gyre hand. Hasty head his in? Its Jabberwock jaws, joy. Jub left, long manxum mimsy, my O of one outgrave. Rested, shun, slain, slithy snickersack, so son, sought, stood, sword. That the thou, thought through, time to took, toes tree, togi. Tum 'twas to uffish, vorpal wade. Went where? Whiffling with wood. So of course, what's the poem?
It comes from Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah. Now, from a Dada perspective, a poem is simply an assemblage of words. And what I did is take all the words in Lewis Carroll's poem, or Charles Dodson, who's a mathematician. I took all the words and organized them alphabetically. It's still the same poem from a Dada perspective. It's still the same poem, but it's inviting the viewer or the audience to participate in the construction of the poem using the same words that the poet used originally, and it is just organized differently. Another way that this poem could be presented in a Dada fashion would be if you had 5 people and each of the people at the same time pronounced every 5th word. So it's still all the same words in the poem, but it's presented in a very different way. And it's asking you to engage as an audience and ask yourself, what makes the poem a poem? It's not just the words, it's not just the order that the words are in, and it's not just the language that the words are in. There's something else. And the poem is still the poem when we read all the words alphabetically. It's just not the same. So I think these are really interesting questions to ask ourselves as we deal with the idea of Dadaism. So I want to play another short video here. And this is just a short 2-minute introduction to Dadaism, or Dada.
Also going to take on the idea of war, although it's happening or really starting after the war begins. In contrast to the futurists, Dadaists or Dadaism or Dada was a reaction to the spectacle of collective homicide, which was the war. Now, it forms during World War I in Zurich in negative reaction to, of course, the war. And they're going to use satire and nonsensical imagery to try and get at the society. They blame society itself for the war. Their pessimism and disgust surfaced in their disdain for tradition. They will attempt to undermine traditional notions of what is art. They're also going to undermine traditional notions of society itself in doing so. Often the Dadaists were lighthearted in their subversion, but at the same time, they're constantly trying to subvert everything. Basically, they're trying to subvert the art market and take it down, show its weaknesses, show its flaws to the general public in a very sort of realist style. They're going to try and show the flaws of society, always doing so with something of a sense of humor. But whose humor? It's kind of a tricky movement to wrap your head around. And by the way, that movement name, Dada, actually comes from nonsense itself. It's said that it's simply an early phrase that babies say or a word that's captured in French. But either way, it doesn't have an actual meaning. There's nothing to it. There's a lack of substance. And that's often the way we look at Dada, even though there's actually quite a bit of substance and stuff in the things that they're creating, in the art that they create and display.
I think that is a really important thing to remember. You know, they're dealing with the idea that actual human beings are dying because the wealthy are not that interested in what ordinary people are like. Oh, my computer froze up. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, because my computer froze up. This is one of the hallmarks about Dada that I think is really validates it in my mind and gets me excited about it. You know, look at Soviet constructivism, it's very hopeful for the future. And Dada, they're driven by anger, but they're doing the same thing that John Cleese and the Monty Python crew did, where they're generating humor out of the anger. And you know, it's not a joke like people hitting each other with those rubber pool sticks. You know, it's not funny like circus clowns, but there's a self-deferential humor to it where the performers will make fun of themselves as thespians. You know, where the poets will make fun of themselves as professional wordsmiths, where the painters will make fun of themselves as the estate educated painter. And I think it's, again, not knock down, drag out slapstick humor, but a very concrete, self-aware humor where they refuse to take themselves completely seriously. And one of the things I really wanted to share is I found a really early interview with Marcel Duchamp. And I'm going to reference it here. We're not going to watch it necessarily, because one thing that I do want to watch is the Hannah Hulk cut with a kitchen knife. I really want to watch that. So let's hold on for a second. Okay. So, but I do want to reference this interview with Marcel Duchamp. You know, he did not do very many Cubist paintings, but his Cubist work is one of the defining, or some of the defining Cubist works. He really set the stage for all the Cubists that came after him. He didn't do very many ready-mades, but his ready-mades set the standard for conceptual art for the next 100 years, or for the next 80 years. And so he wasn't as prolific as, say, Picasso, but Marcel Duchamp, because he understood what he was doing so clearly and rarely took himself seriously, he really was incredibly formative for not just Dada as a movement, but also he's the guy that empowered us as an audience to take an intelligent stance as we confronted art, as we confront art, still to this day. A very amazing individual. Now, I do want to circle around, and this is about 5 minutes long, and I realize we've been here for almost an hour and a half, but I do want to share this because with Hannah Hoch, it really demonstrates both the sense of humor that the Dada's had about themselves and their own work and about the world around them, living in a time when they are incredibly angry at how, what society has done to itself. But they do it in such a way, the futurists were angry as well, but they wanted to kill everybody that didn't agree with them. And that is not a very self-sustaining way to approach the world, to say the least. And the Dadas, though, by expecting intelligent people to view their work and requiring intelligent people to think, they really felt that they could help build a new world by inspiring us to take action and to correct our own mistakes, essentially, which I think is really nice. So let's watch this, and then we'll talk about it.
This amazing photo montage is by German artist Hannah Hoch, and it's from 1919 and has an extremely long title. Cut with the Kitchen Knife, Dada through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epic of Germany.
1919, that was a really pretty fraught moment. So what was going on?
Political chaos. The government has been completely changed after World War I. There's a lot of conflict between the Spartacists, the far left-wing communists, and the Freikorps was encouraged to attack people by members of the government. So there are all these clashes, and a lot of people end up getting arrested, and some people end up getting killed. And that's just one particular moment. January of 1919, all of that infighting happens.
So all this fragmentation is just beautifully captured here. The contrast from the kind of long war, which would have really focused the country's attention, and then this complete breakdown.
If you think about the title, Cut with a Kitchen Knife, think about the idea of cutting things, literally, right? That works for the photo montage. And she's cutting a swath through all this and piecing things back together in ways that make sense to her. Focusing on the fragmentation as defining culture at that moment.
I'm assuming most of these photographs came from newspapers, from magazines.
They did.
And so it's all immediate and topical, and all relevant at this moment, but it's being reconstructed.
But I love that it's a kitchen knife.
She's very focused on the role of women artists. As a Dadaist, how was she treated? And she wasn't treated very well. I think one of the things she actually had a problem with is a lot of male Dadaists had grand ideas about changing cultural mores and views and gender equity, but then in their practice of that, they did nothing. There's a couple of ways that is visualized here. If we look at the very central image, we actually see one of the foremost German expressionist artists, Katja Kollwitz. And the body underneath her is dancer Nidhi Impekoven. And if you look at the way that forms a central point around which everything else rotates, and there is a sense of movement happening all at the same time. One thing I always think is really interesting is this tiny little head is actually Hannah Hoch. Instead of putting her signature, she puts a little portrait of herself. And what it is it's actually pasted onto the corner of a map which shows the countries in Europe that had women's voting rights at the time. So that's one of the ways that we know she was thinking about the role of women in society and in the art world. So first of all, if you think about this image in terms of quadrants, usually the right side is known as the anti-Dadaist. Now, the people that are in the anti-Dadaist corner are obviously politicians. Kaiser Wilhelm is right here. His head is really big and this figure is quite large. She makes fun of Kaiser Wilhelm with this little figure of two wrestlers that are creating the mustache. So then there are also other political figures. There's General von Hindenburg, the head of him, on the body of this exotic dancer. Down here, there is German Minister of Defense, Gustav Noska, when he's talking to another general, and this general appears standing on their heads. But if we go down here in the lower right corner, we see the world of the Dadaist. Right here it says Dadaisten. So this is the corner that has Hannah Höch and the map. And then it also has other Dadaist figures. There's the Dadaist Raoul Hausmann. Hannah Höch had a relationship with Hausmann for a while. And for a long time, all of the literature on Höch is referred to as the wife of Raoul Hausmann. Here you see the two heads of Dadaist George Gross and Wilhelm Herzfeld, the brother of John Hartfield. And Nidhi Impekoven, the same dancer that's in the center here, is now over here bathing John Hartfield in this bathtub. In here we have Lenin, and then there's another Dadaist, Johannes Bader. And then you see one of the Communist Party leaders, Karl Radek, and he was back and forth between Russia and Germany. So he's very involved with the Communist Party. Karl Marx. Then over here is the head of modern art critic and writer Theodor Daubler, and his head is on top of a baby body.
So really infantilizing all of these
Yeah,
people.
and then they're all men. On the left side, they're forms of Dada. This is Dada propaganda. This is Einstein right here, actually. And he is saying a couple of different things. Right here, this little bit of text is in German. And it says, hey, young man, Dada is not an art trend. That it's not just something that's coming and going, and that it's actually something more meaningful. Now down here, there's a lot of scenes of mass gathering. So we see Karl Liebknecht, one of the German Communist Party leaders, along with Rosa Luxemburg, who were jailed, tortured, and then assassinated in January 19. He's saying, join Dada. Dada is going on all over Europe, and there are different centers of Dada. And they all have different art making practices. And photo montage was central to the Berlin Dadaists.
Well, the whole notion of the kitchen knife is really empowering.
The idea of
That's
domesticity as being
That's right.
something that could undermine cultural values. It's amazing.
I really like that because it very strongly demonstrates, I think, a pretty good picture of what Dada does as a whole. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to find something specific. There we go. And I want to show this to you before we go. But just in that one example of Hannah Höch's cut with a kitchen knife, what kinds of things do you see Dada doing? You know, the movement. You know, it's not just random at all. I mean, they pick a random word to celebrate the movement, to define it, because a movement is, you know, culturally we expect a movement to have a title. So they give it a title and it's just a random word. What else do you see going on?
I see, Andrew, I see a lot of intention in the artist's materials and how they portrayed specifically targeted individuals in their historical context.
Yeah, it is very specific. If you didn't know who those figures were, it wouldn't make any sense, I think. But realizing who those figures were, there's a lot of intention there, you know, quite a bit. But I imagine that first time somebody sees that, even if they knew who all the figures were, they would just assume it's random. And I think that demonstrates kind of a subversive satiricism, I think, to the whole movement, where the people are very self-aware in that they realize that most people are going to completely discount it because their initial interaction, they're just going to assume it's random. And so it becomes very disarming in that way. how about you, Brittany? What thing struck you about what Hannah was doing?
Well, I really enjoyed how there's not a lot of flashiness to it. You know, it's like she's focusing on what's important. So the colors are very muted. Obviously, they're cutouts from papers and stuff like that. But the attention is to, I don't know, like the images themselves and who they are and what they portray instead of the flashiness of it. Like you said, somebody who could just walk on by, but those who are interested and want to know more will study it out and really think about what's going on and why.
Yeah, I think so. And it's what I like as well is that Hannah is excellent observations. One thing that I really like as well is that Hannah is specifically targeting a medium or media that supports her message as well. You know, this is all topical and what's going on right now, and she's using essentially contemporary social media to do that. You know, she's working very much with she's like the Lady Gaga of her time. Lady Gaga created music that is very specific to the time within which the music lived. And Hannah is doing something very specific, using media that is very specific to the time that she's addressing as well, which I think is really interesting. Because, you know, if you're doing, for example, contemporary portraits of sitting presidents, and you're using Renaissance style realism and oil paint, that is going to say something very differently than if you make a portrait of a sitting president using imagery from social media, you know, digital imagery. And she's using essentially cutting edge materials from the social media of her time, which I think is really interesting. Well, I want to, of course, I get excited, and we don't have the time to talk about everything, or, you know, show all the artists that I want to. These are all going to be on published like tonight or tomorrow. I'm sorry, I told Van that I was having some issues with my computer. So what I wanted to do is just show some imagery of others of the Dada artists. And I'm pulling up the images right now so we can see those in just a sec. But another thing that I think is really interesting about the Dadaists is that, like the Soviet constructivists, they use the magic of communication to really connect each other. These aren't people that are all from the same neighborhood. These are people from throughout Europe, and they were able to coordinate their efforts as a movement by the miracles of modern communication, you know, modern to the time within which they live. Let's see. And I'm sorry, I'm struggling just a little bit. We'll get there in just a sec here. Another thing that I see about the Dadaists is that they are very, very self-aware. Hannah Holt not only used social media of her time, but she even signed her name to the piece using the same visual language that she had established throughout the piece, which I think is really kind of fun, being very, very, very self-referential. So some of these other artists, and we'll just go through really quick. This is another artist that reminds me very much of Marc Chagall, Picabia. He was another one. He was kind of a surrealist, but he did things specifically trying to avoid the conventions of narrative expectation. And so he does this almost Andy Loomis, which was a contemporary in the U.S. Style portrait of a person. And then on the other hand, he turns around and does something like this, which feels very exuberantly surrealistic. It does a lot of really interesting kinds of things. And he is a surrealist, but the surrealists, I think, grew out of the Dadaists as well. So he does a lot of different kinds of things. And this is Kurt Schwitters. He is something of a cubist, but instead of setting up or imaging the urban landscape like some of the cubists did, or creating a still life and a cubist expression, what he did is he just collected random objects and did portraits of collections of random objects. So it does feel cubist, but it feels like even when we look at some of the more difficult to understand cubist things, they still are centralized around a theme, and that theme could be a person sitting in a hammock, or a still life in an apartment, or like the apartment building across the street from your window. And the difference is with Kurt Schwitter, he just pulls random objects out and puts them together to create a new image. And so he's more exploring the idea of paint and cubism and the elements of a still life, rather than creating any sort of a still life that makes any sort of a sense, which I think is really an interesting way to approach painting. But that purposeful lack of narrative connection really soundly puts it into Dada, and is itself a statement on the disconnected nature of society and the need to find connection with and direction within society. And then this is by Jan ARTH, and this is called Collage with Squares Arranged According to the Laws of Chance. And if we look at the image itself, it doesn't feel like there's anything that has any relation to chance about it at all. And I think that this bears some relationship to the idea that they use a nonsense word to describe the movement, to kind of make fun and point at the necessary irrationality of titles. And I think that Jan ARTH is doing a similar kind of thing with this, or what Magritte did saying this is not a pipe, where he's again pointing at a very formalist image and saying, no, this is not formalist, this is entirely random, which obviously it isn't. And I think that that's really kind of interesting. I've made windows before where I'm supposed to, the customer wants it to look random. The commissioner wants it to look random. But have you ever tried to do something that's actually entirely random? It's almost impossible. Just the nature of creating something random, you have to do it with a lot of intention so that it appears random. I think it's a really good example of what Dada does. And Roel Hausman, he was the partner to Hannah Hoch. He does this kind of steampunk sculpture that I think is really very impressive and beautiful, where he's taking apparently random objects and putting them onto the head of a dressmaker's dummy, making this image here that, because of the design, this design of a dressmaker's dummy, I think in itself is kind of a beautiful object. And then these other things appear to us to be kind of randomized. But again, just like with Hannah Hoch, every element has a very specific meaning and intention behind it. So, just like a casual observer looks at the Hannah Hoch image and thinks it's random, same thing with Raoul. He's creating this object that appears to be random configuration of objects when actually it is entirely intentional. So almost the exact opposite of what Kurt Schwitters was doing with his still life paintings, where he would actually take intentionally random objects and make something that's presented as a cohesive still life from them. And then what's your experience with Man Ray? He was a photographer. He would do something that he called rayographs because he really loved the idea of using photography as almost a painterly medium. And he would do in his photography what Marcel Duchamp would do with his sculpture. Marcel Duchamp would find objects, completely decontextualize them, and present them in a new way to ask you to think about the whole process of the labeling of objects with the title of art. And Man Ray would do the same kind of thing with his photography. You know, he would do a very formalist construction, a very tight formalist photograph of random objects. And he would display them in a way where you begin to see the graphic intentionality and beauty of the object itself. And I think that it's really absolutely fascinating. And he made a lot of these. They were called rayographs because of how he would present them. And this is kind of a fun animated video where it talks about how he came up with them. But, you know, he would do these in-camera photo montages, playing with reflections within the shutter and the entire process of development of a photo. Again, using he's using deceptively mundane objects and celebrating them, asking the viewer to kind of participate with the inherent humor. Do you remember one of those critiques about Marcel Duchamp's nude descending a staircase? A critique said something as mundane as descending a staircase is completely inappropriate for the respect due the portrayal of a nude. You know, and Man Ray is playing on that idea as well. Max Ernst is another artist. He was a successful painter, and he started playing with the ideas of collage as well in a very similar way that Hannah Hoch was doing. But instead of creating this rather intense narrative landscape with all the imagery, he would do these remind me more of like the Dutch Baroque landscapes, where they're actually just cloud scenes. You know, you have a very simple, formalized depiction of a landscape with a huge sky to kind of emphasize a very simple a very simple viewpoint where it's primarily just the sky. And then Max Ernst would do the same kind of thing with the collages. So he's not putting an awful lot into it, but he's created a rather satisfying landscape image with Hannah Hoch's kind of surrealist collage style. And I think it's really fascinating what he does. This is the Murdering Airplane, and I think it makes very specific and targeted reference to the very expensive use of airplanes as essentially, you know, suicide weapons in World War I. I mean, the survival rate of those pilots was incredibly tiny, and the airplanes were essentially made out of lacquered paper. Can you imagine that today? Can you imagine anybody being willing to support Congress if they wanted to buy weapons made out of paper? You know, to put our children in to fight a war? It's astonishing to me. And then there was I also have a spoken word video from Tristan Zara, who is another Dada artist. And again, we're not going to watch that, but I wanted to share that with you as another depiction. There were Dada poems, there were Dada plays, and they also made just as much sense as my restructuring of Jabberwocky. I mean, the intent was not to present something that was cohesive and made sense. The intent was to get you to think about your expectations of what made sense. Because ultimately, you're the one responsible for creating your environment. And if your environment doesn't make sense, you need to be proactive in changing it. And so the Soviet constructivist, I think, was the positivity about it was led by hopefulness. And I think that, I think Alan Alda, one of his characters in a Woody Allen movie, said humor is tragedy plus time. You know, when it's so tragic, the only thing you can do is either cry or laugh, and you don't have the energy to cry. Which, you know, Woody Allen had his characters say some really good things in a lot of the movies. And I think that that's where Dadaism is coming from, where ultimately it is positive, but it's coming because they've chosen not to shoot everybody that disagrees with them, but to depend on the intelligence of the viewer to laugh at the stupid things we're doing. So what do you guys think about that? This is the longest one. I'm sorry I did get carried away. I will try to keep the others to about an hour and a half, like I promised. But I just get really excited about these perspectives where people are living in desperate, horrible, nasty, terrible times, and they've chosen to use powers of construction and creativity to address the very real life and death problems that they encounter. And I think that speaks quite a bit to the ingenuity of the human being, the resilience of the human being. And I think it's amazing. But as we wind up, any last thoughts about what we looked at?
Really interesting. I didn't know much about that before, and so that was a really interesting perspective, especially the Soviet constructivism. That was really a really interesting concept to learn.
Well, we've been trained, you know, all of us are from a generation that's been trained to believe that the Soviets were the epitome of evil on Earth. And I think it's really kind of fun to see how beautiful this constructivist stuff was, how hopeful. And it didn't need those good, solid American values involving religion to be beautiful. So I really like that. And the Dadas, I think the thing that I like the most about them is how frustrating they are to people that don't take the time to think about it. You know, none of that art makes any sense at all unless you look at it intentionally, even for a moment. And once you start looking at it, once you put a little bit of effort into it, they welcome you with open, you know, these artists welcome you with open arms because they demand a smart audience. And I love that too. I love the fact that they are very conscious that their meaning is a result of your participation in the development of that meaning. And they need you to be smart. I love that. You don't get that an awful lot, especially in the world of TikTok videos. You know, just we'll all laugh at somebody tripping while they're carrying a cake or a pie, but it's quite a bit different when we're asked to laugh at ourselves for doing the dumb things that we do. Well, I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful week and weekend. And next week, I will try really hard not to get so carried away so that we can keep it down to an hour and a half and talk about other things. But this kind of stuff just gets me really excited. I love seeing artists that are producing art for real reason without setting themselves up as incredibly important people. I think that's wonderful. All right, well, I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful weekend and week, and try really hard not to have so much fun you end up getting arrested.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.